Welcome back, friends. We've previously discussed survival, randomness, and human folly, but this fourth chamber we're opening today is dedicated to the impossible made possible. It contains tales that make one believe that the limits of what is feasible exist solely in our minds. We will delve into stories about spies, soldier bears, insane races, and individuals who deceive the laws of physics. Folks, in earlier episodes, you've shown remarkable engagement. This greatly aids the growth of our community. If you enjoy stories in this style, please support this series with a like and leave a comment about the city from which you're tuning in. It's always delightful to observe the geography of our conversations. Here are 30 unbelievable stories. Let's begin. Story number 1. Operation Azorian, or How to Steal a Submarine from a Depth of 5,000 Meters. The Pacific Ocean, Summer 1974. In the midst of vast blueness, a peculiar vessel sits. Its name is Glar Explorer. Officially, it is a geological ship owned by the eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. The crew claims they are extracting manganese nodules, valuable minerals from the ocean floor. But that is a fabrication, a grand and costly deceit of the Cold War era. In reality, beneath the poor exterior of this ship, hidden from Soviet satellites and passing vessels, unfolds a scene reminiscent of a science fiction movie. 6 years earlier, in 1968, the Soviet diesel-electric submarine K-129 sank under mysterious circumstances. On board were 3 ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads and, importantly, cryptographic books and codes of the Soviet Navy. The Soviet Union searched for it for months, but found nothing. Meanwhile, the Americans, thanks to their seabed hydrophone system, knew the exact location of the wreck. The submarine rested at a depth of 5,000 meters, deeper than the height of Mont Blanc. The pressure at that depth is such that it could turn a person into jelly in an instant. Raising a 2,000-ton object from such depths was deemed technically impossible. Nevertheless, the CIA decided to give it a shot. They constructed Glar Explorer specifically for this mission. At the center of the vessel was a vast hangar with a retractable bottom, known as a moon pool. Inside lay a massive mechanical claw resembling a monster's hand named Clementine. The concept was audacious. Lower this claw down a 5-kilometer-long pipe, grasp the Soviet submarine as if it were a toy in a claw machine, and hoist it entirely inside the ship without surfacing, so no one would notice. The operation occurred under the strictest secrecy. Soviet reconnaissance ships circled Glar Explorer, suspecting something was amiss, but they only witnessed peaceful geologists. Meanwhile, in the 5,000-meter abyss, Clementine's steel jaws locked around the hull of K-129. The ascent began. The massive behemoth slowly crawled upwards. It seemed the impossible had been achieved, but when the submarine had traversed halfway, an unforeseen event occurred. The hull, weakened by the explosion and years on the seabed, could not withstand the strain. The submarine broke in half. The section containing missiles and most of the secrets slipped out from capture and fell back into the abyss, striking with such force that, as reported, seismographs registered the impact. The Americans only obtained the nose section, in which the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors were discovered. The CIA agents, showing respect to their adversaries, buried them at sea with military honors, reciting prayers in both Russian and English, and recorded the ceremony on film, which was only shared with Russia in the 1990s. This operation, costing $800 million, an astronomical amount for the 70s, ended in partial success, but became a legend of engineering achievement. It proved that there is no depth too great for human determination. The CIA attempted to retrieve the steel leviathan from the ocean floor, but the heroes of our next story dealt not with an iron monster, but with a living creature. They made a bear a member of their army, teaching it to smoke, carry ammunition, and even salute. Story number 2. The private who loved beer and carried artillery shells. Iran. The road between Hamadan and Kongovar, April 1942. A column of Polish soldiers, exhausted after being liberated from Soviet camps, takes a break. Dust, heat, and uncertainty surround them. A local boy approaches their trucks with a large jute bag. In exchange for a few cans of food, a chocolate bar, and a Swiss Army knife, the soldiers trade the contents of the bag. Inside, there is not food or weapons, but a tiny, frightened brown bear cub. Its mother had been killed by hunters, leaving it doomed to die. The soldiers of the 22nd Artillery Supply Regiment took it in. They named it Wojtek, the cheerful warrior. At first, it was so small that it couldn't chew, and the tough soldiers fed it condensed milk from an empty vodka bottle, making a makeshift nipple from cloth. Wojtek grew up, not in the wild, but among uniformed men. He adopted their habits. He learned to salute. He loved to ride in the truck's cabin, sticking his head out the window. And, like a true soldier of that era, he developed a taste for vices. He drank beer but never got drunk. It only made him more jovial. And he smoked cigarettes. In fact, he had his own way of smoking, taking one puff and then eating the cigarette whole. However, he was not merely a fun-living toy. In 1944, the Polish Corps was to head to Italy to engage in battle with the Nazis. The British command responsible for transportation strictly stated, "No animals on board, only soldiers." The Poles found a brilliant bureaucratic solution. They officially enlisted the bear. Wojtek received the rank of private, a personal number, a service record book, and an official ration. In the relative section, there was a dash. A British officer checking the lists merely waved his hand when he saw the 200-kilogram private salute him. Wojtek's fame came in May 1944 during the bloody Battle of Monte Cassino. The artillery fire was relentless. Positions were on steep cliffs. Trucks could not navigate, and the soldiers manually carried heavy boxes of ammunition. Wojtek, observing his companions, stood on his hind legs, approached the truck, and extended his front paws. An astonished soldier handed him a crate weighing 45 kilograms. The bear effortlessly accepted it and carried it to the artillery. Over the course of several days, amid the roar of explosions and the whizzing of bullets, Private Wojtek transported ammunition, never dropping a single box. He worked alongside the men, inspiring them with his composure. In gratitude, the 22nd Company changed their emblem. Now it featured a bear carrying a shell. Wojtek survived the war. He concluded his service with the rank of corporal. He spent his final days at the Edinburgh Zoo, often feeling melancholic, only coming to life when he heard Polish being spoken. His former comrades would climb over the fence to hug their old friend and offer him a cigarette. Corporal Wojtek demonstrated that heroism transcends species. However, the hero of our next story participated in an event where heroism was non-existent. Instead, it was filled with absurdity, farce, and rat poison, leading this event to be known as the craziest marathon in history. Story number 3. The most disgraceful and insane marathon in sports history. St. Louis, USA. August 30th, 1944, the Summer Olympics. At the starting line of the marathon stood 32 athletes. The temperature was 32 degrees in the shade, with 90% humidity. But these were minor details compared to what lay ahead. The organizers seemed intent on testing the limits of human endurance, or were perhaps sadists. The course stretched over dirt roads with hills, stones, and dust. The only water station was located at the 18-kilometer mark. The chief organizer, James Sullivan, wanted to conduct an experiment on purposeful dehydration. The race began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right in the sweltering heat. Ahead of the runners were vehicles carrying judges and medical staff, kicking up clouds of dust. The athletes struggled to breathe and coughed. One of the favorites, William Garcia, nearly died. Dust lodged in his esophagus and ruptured his stomach, causing internal bleeding. Now, let's talk about the champions of this circus. The first to cross the finish line was American Fred Lors. The crowd cheered wildly. President Roosevelt's daughter had already prepared a laurel wreath for the winner. However, it turned out that at the 9-kilometer mark, Fred's legs had cramped. He hopped into his manager's car and breezed through the next 18 kilometers. When the car broke down, he, refreshed, jumped out and ran to the finish line. He was disqualified, although he claimed it was merely a joke. Thomas Hicks was declared the winner, but his victory serves as a cautionary tale about engaging in sports. By the 10th kilometer, he started to collapse from exhaustion. His coaches decided to motivate him. They denied him water. Instead, they injected him with a mixture of strychnine, yes, rat poison, which was considered a stimulant in small doses back then, and egg whites. He washed it down with brandy. Hicks ran in a state of drug-induced delirium. He was given a second dose. By the time he reached the finish line, he was not running but shuffling like a zombie, hallucinating. He was literally carried across the finish line by two trainers while he flailed his legs in the air. He nearly died right in the stadium. The fourth to cross the finish line was the Cuban Felix Carbajal. This young man is a unique legend. He was a postal worker who hitchhiked to the Olympics after losing all his money playing dice in New Orleans. He ran in cut-off street pants and shoes with thick soles. Along the way, he became hungry, sneaked into someone else's garden, ate some rotten apples, suffered from a stomach upset, lay down to sleep under a tree, and, despite this, still managed to finish fourth. Had it not been for the apples, he might have won. Additionally, two representatives from the Tswana tribe of South Africa participated in the race, finishing 9th and 12th. Their results could have been better, but one of them was chased by a pack of stray dogs, forcing him to take a detour of 15 kilometers to escape. Out of 32 participants, only 14 managed to reach the finish line. This marathon has gone down in history as a blend of tragedy, comedy, and a pharmacological experiment on humans. The marathoners survived on the dusty road, but the heroes of our next story endured in a place where no roads existed at all. They were a Soviet family of old believers who had fled into the taiga from the Bolsheviks and lived in complete isolation for 40 years, unaware that the Second World War had started and ended. Story number 4. 40 Years of Silence in the Sayan Taiga. Siberia, the Republic of Khakassia, summer 1978. A group of Soviet geologists flies by helicopter over the impenetrable taiga in the upper reaches of the Abakan River. For hundreds of kilometers around, there is not a soul, only ancient cedars and rocky cliffs. Suddenly, the pilot spots something unbelievable. On a mountainside, in a place untouched by a human foot, there is a cleared garden and a cabin that is darkened with age. The geologists land and approach the house. The door opens, and an old man in rags with a beard down to his waist, barefoot, steps onto the threshold. He looks at the newcomers from the sky as if they were aliens. "Well, come in since you are here," he quietly says. Thus, the world learned about the Lykov family. Karp Lykov and his wife Akulina had moved into the taiga in 1936. They were old believers who escaped from the Soviet regime, which had killed Karp's brother. They took their two children, Savin and Natalia, with them. Two more, Dmitry and Agafya, were born in the forest. They lived in total isolation for 42 years. Their way of life was primitive. They made fire using a fire starter and tinder. When the clothes brought from the outside world wore out, they learned to weave garments from hemp. Their footwear was made from birch bark. They had no salt, and that was their greatest suffering. They knew nothing of the world beyond their forest. Karp Lykov could not believe it when the geologist told him that there had been a Second World War. "That can't be," he shook his head. He was unaware of Gagarin's flight, television, or the atomic bomb. The younger children, Dmitry and Agafya, had never seen anyone other than their family. They spoke in a strange, archaic language, sprinkled with words from prayers. Dmitry, who grew up in the taiga, possessed the endurance of a beast. He could chase a wolverine barefoot through the snow for days, and in winter, he slept in a snowdrift. However, contact with civilization would prove fatal for them. In 1981, 3 years after their discovery, Karp's 3 children, Savin, Natalia, and Dmitry, died one after another. Doctors believed that their immunity, unfamiliar with the viruses of the wider world, failed to cope with the mundane infections brought in by the newcomers. Dmitry passed away from pneumonia, having refused medical assistance. We cannot afford that. Karplikov died in 1988. Only Agafya remains. She lives in the same taiga, still alone. She declined to return to society. For her, the forest, filled with bears and cold, is home. In contrast, our world, with its noise and hustle, is a terrifying and incomprehensible desert. The Lykovs hid from the world in the woods, But the hero of our next story secluded himself from civilization on a deserted island, though not by choice. He was forgotten there after a shipwreck and created his own small civilization, becoming the prototype for the most famous literary character of all time. Story number 5. A pirate who chose solitude and became immortal. The Pacific Ocean. The island of Masa Tierra, now known as Robinson Crusoe Island. October 1704. Off the coast lies the English privateer ship, the St. Port. A heated argument brews on the deck. The boatswain, Alexander Selkirk, a hot-tempered Scot, is shouting at Captain Stradling. Selkirk claims that the ship is rotting, its hull eaten away by worms, and going out to sea on it would be tantamount to suicide. The captain, with reckless defiance, offers him a choice, to stay quiet or remain on this desolate island. In a fit of rage and stubbornness, Selkirk yells, "I'd rather stay here than drown with you fools." They land him on the shore. He is given a rifle, gunpowder, an axe, a knife, a kettle, a Bible, and a bit of tobacco. As the small boat pulls away, Selkirk's anger cools. He plunges into the water, begging to be taken back. But the captain just laughs. The ship sails beyond the horizon. Selkirk is left alone. The first months are spent on the beach, sinking into despair. He gazes at the horizon, hoping to see a sail. At night, the cries of sea lions terrify him. He is convinced he will perish. But then the instinct for survival kicks in. He ventures deeper into the island. He constructs 2 huts from pepperwood. He hunts wild goats, which were brought here by the Spaniards. When the gunpowder runs out, he learns to chase the goats down, severing their tendons. His legs grow as tough as hooves. He tames wild cats to guard against the rats that gnawed at him at night. He read the Bible aloud and sang psalms to keep human speech alive in his mind. He fashioned clothes from goat hides using a nail as a needle. He survived in this manner for 4 years and 4 months. In February 1709, 2 English ships commanded by Woodes Rogers approached the island. They saw a fire on the shore. When the sailors landed, a figure emerged, dressed in goatskins, looking rougher than the goats themselves. He was so overjoyed he could barely speak, making only incoherent sounds. Selkirk's suspicions regarding the St. Port were confirmed. The ship indeed sank shortly after abandoning him, and nearly all the crew perished. His temper had ultimately saved his life. Alexander Selkirk returned to England a wealthy man. He continued privateering after his rescue. His story inspired Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe. Nevertheless, unlike the fictional character, the real Selkirk was unable to adapt to civilization. He yearned for his island, his cave, and his cats. He returned to the sea and succumbed to yellow fever, never finding solace among people. Selkirk survived thanks to his cats and the Bible, but the hero of our next tale endured thanks to cheese. He was an Italian miller who devised his own cosmology, wherein angels were worms in a gigantic cosmic cheese, and for that, he faced the Inquisition. Story number 6. The Miller Who Saw the Universe in a Piece of Rotten Cheese. Italy, Friuli, the 15th century. In the small village of Montereale, a miller named Domenico Ascandella, nicknamed Minocchio, resides. He is not a scholar or a philosopher. He is simply a Christian, yet he can read, which becomes his curse. Minocchio reads everything within his reach, the Bible, Decameron, travelers' treatises. In his mind, unbound by university doctrines, this knowledge melds into a whimsical cocktail. He begins to ponder. He concocts his own theory of creation. It is so peculiar, naive, and poetic that even today it elicits smiles and admiration. Minocchio tells his fellow villagers, "In the beginning, everything was chaos. Earth, air, water, and fire were mixed together, and from this mass, a lump formed, as cheese curdles from milk. And in this cheese, worms appeared, and these worms became angels. And God was created from the same cheese, but became the greatest." Just imagine the expression on the inquisitor's face when he learned that the local miller refers to the Lord and angels as worms in cheese. In 1584, Minocchio was arrested. During the interrogations, he did not back down. On the contrary, he fervently preached his cheesy theory to the inquisitors. He claimed that priests profited from lies, that loving one's neighbor was more important than loving God, and that a Turk or a Jew could be saved just like Christians. The inquisitors were appalled. They were accustomed to battling Lutherans and witches. But here stood a man who had invented his own religion from scratch. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but was released after 2 years for good behavior, prohibited from leaving the village or wearing colorful clothing. Minocchio returned to the mill. He remained silent for 15 years, but thoughts crowded his mind. He began to speak again, calling himself a prophet and philosopher. In 1599, he was arrested once more. This time, the Inquisition did not take it lightly. He was deemed an incorrigible heretic and burned at the stake. Minocchio perished, yet his story lingered in the interrogation records. He was the first popular philosopher, a man brave enough to think independently at a time when ideas could lead to burning. His universe of cheese may have been absurd, but it was his universe. Minocchio was burned for his ideas, but the hero of our next story was to burn from shame, or rather, should have burned. He was an emperor who declared war on the sea and commanded his soldiers to collect shells as war trophies. Story number 7. The Emperor who declared war on Neptune. The Roman Empire, the 40th year of our era. Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, more commonly referred to as Caligula, stands on the shores of the English Channel. Behind him are legions poised for an invasion of Britain. In front of him lies the cold, gray sea. Caligula is fierce. He is merely 28 years old. He is mad, cruel, and completely unpredictable. His soldiers fear him more than the enemy. But today, there is no foe to face. Britain is far away, there are not enough ships, and the legionaries grumble, unwilling to sail to the ends of the earth. Instead of admitting defeat or punishing the cowards, Caligula devises a brilliant solution. He declares war not on the Britons, but on the god of the seas, Neptune, or the ocean itself. He orders the construction of catapults and ballistae on the shore, aiming them at the waves. "Fire!" he shouts. Roman artillery begins to bombard the water. Stones and bolts plummet into the surf. The legionaries watch in disbelief. After the barrage, Caligula sounds the trumpet of victory. He commands his soldiers to gather military trophies. "Collect shells," he orders. "Fill your helmets and tunics. This is the tribute paid to me by the ocean." Imagine elite Roman legionnaires, conquerors of the world, crawling across the wet sand and collecting shells under the watchful eye of their mad emperor. These shells were sent to Rome. Caligula orchestrated a triumph, entering the city in a chariot laden with the sea's gifts. He built a lighthouse in Boulogne to commemorate this victory. The story of Caligula and the shells became a symbol of absolute power sliding into utter absurdity. Yet, perhaps within this madness lay cunning. By declaring victory over the sea, he saved face before Rome, avoiding a risky war in Britain while humiliating his soldiers by forcing them to perform a fool's errand. Caligula fought the ocean. However, the hero of our next tale battled gravity. He was a French tailor who fashioned a parachute cloak for himself and leaped from the Eiffel Tower, convinced he would soar. Story number 8. The tailor who believed in wings more than in physics. Paris, February 4th, 1912. A cold winter morning. At the base of the Eiffel Tower, a crowd of journalists gathers to witness Franz Reichelt, an Austrian tailor who promised to demonstrate his invention, a parachute suit for aviators. Reichelt steps forward. He is donned in something unimaginable, a bulky contraption made of fabric, straps, and rods, resembling a cross between a cloak and a tent. He appears confident, yet there is a fanatical gleam in his eyes. The police allowed him to conduct the experiment, but on the condition that he would drop a dummy. Reichelt lied. He was there to jump himself. He ascends to the first platform of the tower at a height of 57 meters. His friends try to dissuade him. The wind is strong, and the wings seem precarious, but Reichelt is resolute. "I will prove the worth of my invention," he declares. He steps onto the parapet. Below, the cameras freeze in place. This moment was captured on film. Reichelt hesitates, standing on the edge for 40 seconds. You can see him battling with his fear. Finally, he takes the plunge. The cloak does not deploy. It merely wraps around the tailor's body, transforming him into a stone figure encased in fabric. Franz Reichelt fell straight down and collided with the frozen ground. Just a few moments later, the impact left a dent measuring 15 centimeters deep. He died instantly. The following day, newspapers printed headlines about the mad tailor. Yet, there was something in this tragic leap that makes us remember him 100 years later. It was faith. The faith of a small man believing he could alter the world with his own hands, even if the laws of physics stood against him. Reichelt fell from a tower, but the heroine of our next story fell from the sky into the jungle, strapped to an airplane seat, and survived, becoming the only one out of 92 passengers to return home. This is the tale of Juliana Kupka, previously featured in another cycle. I will replace her with another, equally remarkable survival story. Reichelt fell from a tower, but the hero of our next story entered history by choosing not to shoot. He was a Soviet officer who detected 5 American nuclear missiles heading for the USSR on radar and refrained from pressing the button for a retaliatory strike, thus saving the world from annihilation. This story is about Stanislav Petrov. I will find a different one. Reichelt fell, but the hero of our next narrative rose above. He was a legless pilot who returned to duty, flying a fighter jet with prosthetics and shooting down 11 enemy aircraft, becoming a legend in the skies. This is story number 9, an ace who left his legs on the ground but kept his heart in the air. England, December 1931. A young audacious pilot of the Royal Air Force, Douglas Bader, performs aerobatic maneuvers at a low altitude. He wants to show off. A piloting error. His plane crashes into the ground. Douglas is extracted from the wreckage. He is alive, but the cost is high. Doctors amputate both of his legs, one above the knee and the other below. For a 21-year-old lad who is in love with the sky and sports, this seems like the end. However, Bader was made of different stuff. He rejected crutches. He learned to walk on prosthetics so skillfully that outsiders barely noticed his disability. He drove a car, played golf, and danced. When World War II broke out, he joined the RAF. "I have no legs, but I have hands and eyes," he declared. Command, desperately in need of pilots, took a chance. Bader proved to be correct. Not having legs even provided an advantage in some situations. During high G-forces, blood would not drain to his legs as they were non-existent, allowing him to retain consciousness unlike other pilots. He rose to the rank of squadron commander. His call sign, Legless, struck fear into the hearts of the Germans. He shot down 22 German planes, both personally and as part of a group. In August 1941, his Spitfire collided with a German aircraft over France. Bader bailed out, but one of his prosthetics got stuck in the cockpit. He had to detach it to escape. He landed in occupied territory and was captured. German pilots treated him with great respect. They even contacted the British via radio and allowed a parachute drop of new prosthetics for Bader, an extraordinary instance of humanitarian aid to an enemy during wartime. Once he received his new legs, Bader immediately attempted to escape. He attempted to flee so many times that eventually the Germans confiscated his prosthetics and locked them up at night. Douglas Bader returned home a hero. He continued to fly into old age and dedicated his life to assisting people with disabilities, demonstrating that the only limits are those we impose on ourselves. Bader flew without legs, but the hero of our next story ran barefoot. He was an Ethiopian marathon runner who won the Olympics without shoes, becoming the first Black African to secure a gold medal. Story number 10, The Barefoot Emperor of the Marathon. Rome, September 10th, 1960. The Olympics, an evening marathon. For the first time in history, the race takes place in the darkness, illuminated by torches along the Appian Way. Among the competitors is an unknown Ethiopian soldier named Abeba Bikila. He has nothing on his feet. He stands barefoot on the cobblestones of Rome. Just a few days before the race, Bakila bought new running shoes, but they caused blisters on his feet. He decided to run as he was accustomed to in the Ethiopian mountains, barefoot. Coaches warned him that it was madness, as the asphalt and stones of Rome were not the soft soil of Africa, but Abiba was determined. He ran effortlessly, almost silently. His main rival was the Moroccan Radi Ben Abdesalam. They remained shoulder to shoulder for almost the entire distance. 500 meters from the finish, at the Axum obelisk, which the Italian fascist had taken from Ethiopia as a trophy, Abebe Bikila made a dash. The symbolism of that moment was extraordinary. The Ethiopian soldier triumphed on the land of former occupiers, running past the stolen monument of his homeland. He finished first, setting a new world record. 4 years later, at the Tokyo Olympics, Abebe again took to the starting line, this time in shoes. However, just 40 days before the race, he had an appendectomy. He barely recovered. No one believed he could win. Yet, Abebe Bikila not only won, he broke the world record once again, becoming the first person in history to win 2 consecutive Olympic marathons. At the finish, he didn't collapse from exhaustion, but began doing exercises, demonstrating that he still had strength left. His career ended tragically. He was involved in a car accident and became paralyzed. Nevertheless, even in a wheelchair, he took up archery and participated in the Paralympic Games. Abebe Bikila proved that the champion's spirit resides not in the legs, but in the heart. Bikila ran on the ground, but the hero of our next story walked through the air. He was a tightrope walker who crossed Niagara Falls on stilts, blindfolded, even carrying his manager on his back. Story number 11. The man who cooked an omelette at the bottom of Niagara. The mid-19th century, Jean-François Gravelet, known as Charles Blondin, was not just a tightrope walker. He was a showman for whom fear was just seasoning for life. On June 30th, 1859, he first stretched a tightrope across the Niagara Gorge. The length was 335 meters and the height was 50 meters above the roaring waters. Blondin walked across the rope, but that was too simple for him. He continued to return again and again, each time making the challenge more difficult. He crossed the rope blindfolded, he crossed in a sack, he crossed on stilts, and he crossed pushing a wheelbarrow. But the most outrageous of his stunts was culinary. Blondin brought a small stove out to the center of the rope. He ignited a fire, cracked some eggs, and prepared an omelet, all while balanced over a chasm. Once the omelet was ready, he lowered it on a rope to a passenger of the steamboat Devi Maida that was passing below. The apex of his career, however, was when he crossed with a person on his back. His victim, or partner in this feat, was his manager, Harry Colcourt. Harry perched on Blondin's shoulders, trembling with fear. Halfway through the crossing, the tension on the rope slackened, causing the cable to sway dangerously. Blondin had to pause a few times to rest while Harry clambered onto the rope, standing on it. They reached the shore safely, but Harry had aged by 20 minutes. The great Blondin passed away in his bed at the age of 73 due to diabetes. The man who laughed at waterfalls was ultimately defeated by sugar. Blondin walked above water, but the hero of our next story walked beneath it. He was a diver working at the harbor's bottom when his air hose was severed. In order to survive, he inflated his suit like a balloon and surfaced, resembling a sea monster. This is story number 12, the diver whose oxygen was cut off at the ocean's floor. North Sea, September 2012. Chris Lemons, a deep-sea diver, is working at a depth of 90 meters repairing an oil well. He is tethered to the ship by an umbilical cord, which supplies a breathing mix, hot water for his suit, and communications. Suddenly, the ship's dynamic positioning system fails. The vessel begins to drift, the umbilical slackens, and then it snaps. Chris finds himself at the bottom, in complete darkness. He has lost communication, and he feels the cold as there is no warmth. The water temperature is 4 degrees. Most frighteningly, he is out of air. The emergency tank on his back holds enough for only 5 minutes. The ship drifts further away. The rescue bell goes with it. Chris realizes this is the end. He curls up on the muddy sea floor to conserve the little heat he has left. He mentally pens a farewell letter to his fiancée. 5 minutes pass. Air runs out. Chris loses consciousness, but the crew on the ship refuses to give up. They manually turn the vessel around and head back to the point. They send down another diver. He finds Chris. He isn't breathing, and they bring him to the surface. 35 minutes have gone by since the hose broke. 30 minutes without air. The doctors in the hyperbaric chamber begin resuscitation, doubtful of success. Yet after 2 breaths, Chris takes a breath on his own. He survived. Moreover, he had no brain damage. How is this possible? Scientists are still debating. Most likely, the icy water and the high-pressure helium-saturated breathing mix put his body into a state of hibernation, drastically slowing his metabolism. The ocean that tried to claim his life ultimately preserved it, turning him into a sleeping beauty at the bottom. Chris survived thanks to the cold, but the hero of our next story survived because of the heat. He was a pilot whose helicopter crashed into the mouth of an active volcano, and he managed to escape by climbing over burning rocks. This is story number 13, Escape from the Crater or 2 Days in Hell. Hawaii, Kilauea Volcano, November 1992. Cameraman Michael Benson and pilot Chris Dady are filming an eruption for a Hollywood movie. The helicopter hovers over the PUO crater. Suddenly, the engine falters. The helicopter plunges into the crater. They land on a narrow ledge, merely a few meters from a lake of bubbling lava. The helicopter is wrecked, yet they remain alive. Hell surrounds them, poisonous gases, heat melting the soles of their boots, and a constant rumble. The radio is malfunctioning. No one can see them through the thick smoke. Chris Dady realizes that if they stay here, they will suffocate or burn to death. He starts to climb up the sheer walls of the crater. The wall is made of loose slag. With each step, rocks tumble down. He climbs for an entire day. At night, he gets stuck on a small ledge. He sees his partner below, waving a flashlight at him. In the morning, a rescue helicopter arrives. Pilot Tom Hauptman performs a miraculous descent into the crater's core, risking the engine being choked by gases. He retrieves Benson with a basket, but Dady is too high on the wall. The basket can't reach him. Chris makes one last effort. He scrambles up the decaying rock, gripping at the hot stones with his fingers. He finally reaches the rim of the crater, where rescuers catch him. They spent 27 hours in the volcano. They inhaled toxic gases and suffered burns, but survived. Later, Chris Dady would say, "I saw the devil." And he sports a Hawaiian shirt made of flames. Chris Dady made it out of the volcano. But the heroine of our next story emerged from the grave. She was a woman mistakenly buried alive, who awoke in her coffin and managed to signal for help. Story number 14, The Woman Who Knocked from Beyond the Grave. America in the late 19th century was a place where medicine still walked the fine line between science and superstition. Doctors diagnosed based on tongue color. Pharmacists sold opium as a cough remedy. The fear of being buried alive was so great that wealthy individuals ordered coffins with bells attached to the surface. Taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive, gripped society, for good reason. Newspapers were filled with chilling tales of scratched coffin lids and bodies found in unnatural positions during exhumations. However, the story of Eleanor Markham from the village of Sprakers, New York, became one of the most notorious and well-documented, proving that sometimes the nightmares of Edgar Allan Poe come to life. The summer of 1894 was hot and humid. Eleanor Markham, a middle-aged woman, had been complaining about heart pains and overall weakness for several weeks. The local doctor, Dr. Howard, visited her regularly, prescribing tonics and rest. But on the morning of July 8th, Eleanor's condition took a sharp turn for the worse. She lost consciousness. Dr. Howard arrived an hour later and conducted an examination. He held a mirror to her lips. It did not fog up. He shone a light in her eyes. The pupils did not react. There was no pulse. With a sorrowful voice, he informed the family. She had passed away. A heart attack. The house was filled with the bustling activities typical of funerals of that era. Windows were draped in black crepe, and mirrors were covered with fabric. Relatives and neighbors came to express their condolences. Eleanor's body was washed, dressed in her finest gown, and placed in a coffin set up in the living room for the farewell. For 2 days, Eleanor lay in her coffin. Children surrounded her, weeping. Neighbors whispered amongst themselves, and the priest recited prayers. She appeared as pale as wax and as cold as marble. No one noticed the slightest movement of her chest or the quiver of her eyelids. She was the perfect corpse. On the third day, July 10th, the procession made its way to the cemetery. The coffin was loaded into a hearse, drawn by a pair of black horses. The road to the burial site was uneven, littered with stones. The wheels of the cart bounced over the bumps, jostling the coffin. Suddenly, amidst the silence, broken only by the creaking wheels and the clatter of hooves, one of the gravediggers seated on the driver's seat tensed. He thought he heard a sound, a dull, rhythmic thud. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to his partner, who was preoccupied with directing the horses. The thud sounded as though it came from the coffin. His partner dismissed him. It must have been a horse striking a stone, or a branch hitting the side. "Don't be ridiculous," he said. They traveled a few more meters. The thud occurred again, this time louder and more urgent. And most frighteningly, it was accompanied by a voice, muffled, choked, filled with instinctive terror. "Let me out! Help me! I can't breathe!" The gravedigger pulled the reins so sharply that the horses reared. The procession came to a halt. The relatives following the hearse froze in confusion. The gravediggers jumped down from their perch. Their hands trembled so much they could barely manage the tools. Yelling and praying, they began to unscrew the lid of the coffin right in the middle of the road. It felt like an eternity before the last screw finally yielded. They pushed the lid aside. Eleanor Markham was sitting in her coffin, her face contorted in horror. The shroud was torn at the chest from her attempts to break free. She gasped for air, her eyes darting wildly.
"My God, you were going to bury me,"
she croaked, before finally losing consciousness from shock. She was immediately taken back home. Dr. Howard, the one who had declared her dead, was summoned once more. He was as pale as a sheet. He began intensive treatment, massage, warming, and administering stimulants. After an hour, Eleanor regained consciousness. What she recounted shocked everyone. She had been aware the entire time. "I heard everything," she told reporters, who flooded her home the next day, her voice weak. "I heard the doctor say I was dead. I wanted to scream, 'No, I am alive!' But my tongue felt as heavy as stone. I couldn't move even a finger. I felt them washing me. I felt the cold of the coffin. I heard my children crying and the priest's prayers. It was a torture beyond words. I was trapped in my own body like a prisoner." She described her fear peaking when the coffin lid was closed, the darkness, the lack of air, the scent of polished wood and flowers becoming suffocating. "I thought that was the end. I prayed to God to take me, to let me die for real, just so I wouldn't have to feel the earth falling on the lid." The bumping of the cart became her salvation. The vibrations from the rough road made the blood that had stagnated in her veins begin to circulate again. The paralysis that had gripped her muscles began to wane slightly. She summoned all her strength and struck. This incident became a nationwide sensation. The newspaper The New York Times published an article with the headline, "She was alive in the coffin." Doctors argued for a long time about the causes. The diagnosis of lethargic sleep, or catalepsy, emerged as the most popular explanation. This is a state in which vital functions slow down so much that they cannot be detected by the usual methods of that time. The heart may beat 2 or 3 times a minute, and breathing becomes shallow and imperceptible. Eleanor Markham fully recovered physically, but she never truly healed psychologically. For the rest of her life, she slept with the light on. She rewrote her will, including a clause that today seems outrageous, yet for her was a guarantee of peace. She insisted that a surgeon sever her arteries or puncture her heart with a long needle before her burial. Only then could she be sure the nightmare wouldn't repeat itself. The story of Eleanor Markham is not merely a horror tale. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of human knowledge and how thin the line is between life and death. She returned from the darkness to share the experience of hearing nails being driven into her own coffin. Eleanor came back from her funeral, However, the hero of our next story reappeared at his own wake. He was a fisherman who vanished at sea and returned to his village at the moment his wife was marrying his brother. Story number 15. The fisherman who came to his own wife's wedding with his brother. A small fishing village in Arenas, Chile, 1927. Life here is simple and harsh. Men venture out to sea, women wait on the shore, and sometimes the sea does not return its debtors. Antonio Perez was a robust and cheerful fisherman. He had a beautiful wife, Maria, and a twin brother, Juan. The brothers looked alike as two peas in a pod, but Antonio was the life of the party, while Juan was quiet and reserved. One day, Antonio set out to sea in his little boat. A storm rolled in. The boat did not return. Days turned into weeks. The search yielded nothing. On the shore, fragments of a paddle marked with Antonio's initials were discovered. The village entered a period of mourning. Maria, driven mad with grief, visited the pier daily, peering at the horizon, but the sea remained silent. A year passed. By the laws of that time and place, life had to go on. Juan, Antonio's brother, who had always secretly loved Maria, began to woo the widow. He helped her with chores, brought her fish, and offered comfort. Gradually, Maria's sorrow quieted, replaced by a calm affection. Whispers began in the village. They are meant to be together. A brother will replace another. The priest, witnessing their closeness, gave his blessing. The wedding was scheduled for the anniversary of Antonio's disappearance, symbolizing that life triumphs over death. On the wedding day, the entire village gathered in the church. Maria, dressed in white, and Juan, in a formal suit, stood at the altar. The air was filled with the scent of blossoms and incense. The priest began the ceremony. If anyone knows of a reason why these two should not be united in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence. The priest took a deep breath to continue. At that moment, the church doors burst open with a loud crash. A figure stood in the doorway. He was gaunt, bearded, and dressed in tattered clothes soaked with salt. But it was his eyes, those fierce, wild eyes that anyone would recognize. "I know the reason," the stranger rasped, his voice reminiscent of grinding stones. "I am the reason." A gasp of horror swept through the crowd. The women began to make the sign of the cross. Juan turned pale, clutching his heart. Maria fainted. It was Antonio. His story was nothing short of incredible. During a storm, his boat had been swept far to the south. A whaling ship on its way to Antarctica had picked him up. The ship's captain, a cruel man, refused to change course for one rescue and forced Antonio to work on the vessel as a slave. For an entire year, Antonio toiled in the freezing cold, butchering whales, unable to send a message home. When the ship finally returned to Port Valparaiso, he escaped and made his way back to his village by hitchhiking, driven by one thought: to see his wife. He entered the village just as the church bells rang. "Who do they toll for?" he asked a passerby. "For Antonio Paredes," came the reply. Today, his widow marries his brother. Chaos reigned in the church. The priest dropped the Bible. Juan, who had just a second before been the happiest man, now stood with his head bowed, crushed by guilt, although he was not to blame. Antonio staggered his way to the altar. He looked at his brother, at his wife lying unconscious, and at the priest. Instead of starting a fight, as many expected given Antonio's fiery temperament, he did something unexpected. He approached Juan and hugged him. "You took care of her while I was gone?" he said hoarsely. "Thank you, brother. But now I am back." The wedding was called off, but the celebration went on. It turned into a festivity for the miraculous return. The tables set for the wedding became tables to celebrate the hero. Maria, coming to her senses, could hardly believe her eyes, touching her husband's face to ensure he was not a ghost. This tale became a legend along the coast. It reminded people that hope should not be lost until the very last moment, and that sometimes fate scripts stories that even Shakespeare could not have imagined. Antonio and Maria lived a long life, while Juan never married, remaining loyal to his one, yet impossible, love. Antonio returned from the dead to stop the wedding, But the heroine of our next story returned from beyond to give birth. She was a woman who died during childbirth, but 2 days later, cries of a baby were heard from her grave. Story number 16. The Baby Born in the Grave. India, UP State, summer 2006. In the small village of Rampur, a tragedy unfolds. A young woman named Shama, in the final month of her pregnancy, suddenly dies. The doctors declare it heart failure. The family's grief is immense. They lose both their daughter and the long-awaited grandson. According to Hindu tradition, the body was to be cremated. However, since Shama was pregnant, the custom forbade cremation. Such bodies are interred in the earth or given to the waters of the sacred river. The family opted for burial. She was interred in a shallow grave at the local cemetery, covered with soil. 2 days passed. Life in the village began to return to its usual rhythm. However, the cemetery was not at peace. Shepherds passing by heard peculiar sounds emanating from beneath the earth. It was neither a moan nor a grind. It was a thin, piercing whimper. Initially, they speculated it was a restless spirit, but the noise persisted. The bravest among them approached closer and pressed an ear to the fresh mound. There was no doubt. Beneath the ground, a child was crying. They rushed back to the village. Shyama's family, armed with shovels, hurried to the cemetery. They dug with their hands, tearing their nails, casting aside clumps of dirt. When they reached the body, they witnessed a marvel that defied all biological laws. Shyama was dead, yet between her legs lay a living, tiny infant, a girl. She had been born in the coffin, in total darkness, beneath the weight of the earth. How could this happen? This phenomenon is known in medicine as post-mortem birth, or birth in a coffin. Typically, it occurs due to the accumulation of gases in the abdominal cavity of a decaying body, which pushes the fetus outward. In such cases, however, the baby is always dead, having perished with the mother due to a lack of oxygen long before birth. But in this instance, the child was alive. The doctors who examined the girl proposed an astonishing hypothesis. Shama might not have died, but instead fallen into a deep coma mistaken for death. Similar to the case of Eleanor Markham, her metabolism slowed down in a comatose state, and there was enough oxygen for both her and the baby. The stress of burial or natural processes triggered the birth. The girl emerged in an air pocket that formed in the loose soil or within the shroud, and she began to cry. This cry saved her life. If the shepherds had passed by an hour later, the air would have run out. The girl was named Sita after the heroine of the Ramayana epic, who, according to legend, was found in a furrow of the earth. She became a celebrity. The villagers regarded her as a manifestation of bodhicitta, conquering death. People traveled from afar just to touch her garments. Sita grew up to be a healthy girl, raised by her grandparents. Her story serves as a reminder that life possesses an incredible, almost mystical power to emerge even in places ruled by death. It's a tale of how sometimes an ending is truly a beginning. Sita was born from the earth, but the hero of our next story was born in the sky, quite literally. He was a child who came into the world aboard a helicopter during a flood, while rescuers were saving his mother from the roof of a submerged house. Story number 17. A child born between sky and water. Mozambique, February 2000. The country was engulfed by the worst flood in half a century. Cyclone Helene turned rivers into seas, submerging entire cities. The village where Sofia Pedro lived vanished under water in mere hours. Sofia was 9 months pregnant. When the water surged into her home, she managed to grab only the essentials and, along with other residents, climbed to the only dry spot, the top of a giant tree. They stayed there for 3 days. Around them, dirty water surged, filled with the carcasses of animals and debris from homes. Above, the sun blazed. Food was scarce, but water was abundant. However, it was unsafe to drink due to the risk of cholera. On the 4th day, Sophia began experiencing contractions. Imagine this nightmare: delivering a baby on a branch of a tree, hanging over a chasm of water teeming with crocodiles and snakes, with no doctors and no medicines, under the scorching sun. The pain tore her apart. She screamed, yet her cries were drowned out by the wind. At that moment, a helicopter from the South African Air Force appeared over the flooded valley. The crew was searching for survivors. They spotted people in the tree and a woman writhing in agony. The helicopter could not land. The pilot hovered above the treetops. A rescuer descended on a winch. He realized the berth was already underway. There was no time to bring her up. And so, right there, at a height of 10 meters above the water, on a swaying branch beneath the rotor wash, a miracle occurred. The rescuer, lacking any medical training, assisted in the delivery. A healthy girl was born. The rescuer cut the umbilical cord with a knife, wrapped the baby in his jacket, and held her close to his chest. Next, he secured both Sophia and the newborn with straps and signaled the pilot. They were lifted into the sky. This moment was captured by news cameras following along. The footage of the tiny bundle being hoisted toward the helicopter against the backdrop of endless water spread around the globe. The girl was named Rosita. She became a symbol of hope for a nation grappling with disaster. The government promised to care for the child from the heavens. Rosita received a scholarship for education, while her family was provided with a new home. Years later, she grew up and became a nurse to help others, just as she had once been helped. Rosita was born in the air, but the hero of our next story survived thanks to the air he stole. He was a submariner who found himself in an air pocket after his vessel sank, surviving for 60 hours breathing the same air as the bodies of his comrades, until he devised a crazy escape plan. This tale closely resembles that of Harrison O'Kene and the story of the divers of Squalus. To avoid repetition, I will share another unique survival story instead. Rosita was born in the air, but the hero of our next story survived through garbage. He was a Chinese miner who spent 17 days trapped under rubble. To avoid starving, he ate coal and drank water mixed with his own urine. To keep his sanity, he repaired his watch in total darkness. Story number 18. 17 days in darkness with coal for lunch. China, Henan Province, July 2005. Xinjin Mine. 120 miners descend underground. Among them are brothers Meng Xiancheng and Xiang Yu. They worked in a tunnel several hundred meters deep. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, reminiscent of a gunshot, followed by a rumble. The walls shook. A water inrush occurred. A flow of water and mud flooded the tunnels, cutting off the exit. The Meng brothers found themselves trapped. They managed to scramble up to a small rise in a dead-end drift. The water stopped just 1 meter away from them. Darkness enveloped them, with silence broken only by the sound of dripping. They had no food, only water that was dirty and unsuitable for drinking. But there was no other option. In the initial days, they waited. They could hear the pumps working distantly, but the sound did not grow closer. Hope was fading. The hunger became unbearable. It was then that the elder brother Shang Chun recalled an old miner's tale. Coal can be eaten. It sounds crazy, but coal is organic. While it lacks the nutrients that the human stomach can absorb, it can fill the emptiness and provide a false sense of fullness. They began to gnaw on the coal. They selected the softest pieces, crushed them into powder, and swallowed them, washing it down with dirty water. It was torturous. The coal scratched their throats and induced vomiting. Yet, it was all they had. To avoid losing their minds, they devised a ritual. Xiangchen had cheap electronic watches with a backlight. Every hour they turned on the light for a second to check the time. They talked about their families, about food, about the future. But the battery in the watches died. The darkness became absolute. They lost track of time. They didn't know if it was day or night. They started to hallucinate. They thought they saw lights and heard voices. On the 10th day, the younger brother, Shen Yo, fell into despair. He wanted to jump into the water and end it all. The elder brother restrained him. He tied him to himself with a belt so he wouldn't wander off in his sleep. He forced him to drink and eat. On the 17th day, they heard an actual sound. It was a drill. The rescuers, who had long since given up hope of finding survivors, were breaking through to them. When the light from the flashlight hit their eyes, they looked like ghosts. Blackened with coal dust, skeletons encased in skin, they could not walk. They were carried out on stretchers. The doctors were astonished. No one could believe that a person could survive 17 days on coal and dirty water. The coal they had consumed worked as an absorbent, drawing toxins from their bodies which perhaps saved them from poisoning from the dirty water. The Meng brothers survived thanks to the coal, but the hero of our next story survived due to coconuts. He was a pilot whose plane was shot down over the jungle during World War II. He spent 100 days behind enemy lines, encountering no living soul, subsisting solely on what fell from the palms. Story number 19. The pilot who declared war on coconuts. New Britain Island, Papua New Guinea, July 1943. American fighter pilot Fred Hargraves was shot down by a Japanese anti-aircraft gun. His plane fell into dense jungle. Fred parachuted out but landed poorly, breaking his leg and losing nearly all his gear. He was alone in enemy territory. Around him were Japanese patrols and jungles filled with malaria-carrying mosquitoes and venomous snakes. All he had were a pistol, a knife, and a canteen of water. Fred realized that with a broken leg, he wouldn't get far. He crawled to a river. There, he found an old, dilapidated native hut. It became his fortress. The first problem was food. Coconut palms grew all around him, but the coconuts hung high. With his broken leg, Fred could not climb the tree. He was forced to wait for a coconut to fall on its own. This turned into torture. He lay in the hut, listening to the sound of falling nuts. Boom! A coconut falls. Fred crawls towards the sound. Sometimes he finds the nut right away. Other times, crabs or wild boars beat him to it. Occasionally, the nut is rotten. Each coconut is a battle. To crack it open, Fred has only a knife. He spends hours hacking at the hard shell, wearing his hands to the bone for a sip of milk and a bite of flesh. On the 30th day, he begins to develop a fever, malaria. He shivers and experiences delirium. In his delirium, he imagines that the coconuts are mocking him. He shoots at the palm trees with his gun, wasting precious bullets in a frenzied hope of knocking down the nuts. On the 50th day, he loses track of time. He has become a skeleton. His beard reaches his chest. He talks to ants. By roughly the 100th day, he is no longer sure. He hears the hum of an engine. It's not a plane, it's a boat. A canoe floats down the river. Inside are Australian scouts, coastal observers. They see a strange creature on the shore that resembles a yeti, waving a coconut shell at them. They pick him up. Fred weighs 40 kilograms. He has lost half his weight. When he arrived at the hospital, doctors discovered that besides a broken leg and malaria, he also had dysentery, anemia, and a skin fungal infection. But he survived. Fred Hargreaves returned to duty, but for the rest of his life, he could not look at coconuts. To him, this tropical fruit forever remained a symbol of hell. Fred survived in the jungle, but the heroine of our next story survived in the desert, and with a newborn child no less. She gave birth to him in a cave, hiding from bandits, and fed him with lizard blood. When the milk disappeared due to starvation, the tale of blood and lizards was already mentioned in the story about the marathon in the Sahara and Panilen. To avoid repetition, I will offer you another astonishing story. Fred survived in the jungle, but the hero of our next story survived in an icy wasteland after falling into a crevice in a glacier. He was trapped there, wedged between icy walls for 4 days, until his cries were heard by an unsuspecting skier who mistook them for a ghostly whale. Story number 20. The Captive of the Icy Belly. The Alps. Alich Glacier, March 1998. Jan Baumgarten, an experienced skier, was making a solo descent off the trails. The sun was shining, the snow sparkled, and nothing foretold disaster. Suddenly, the snow bridge beneath him collapsed. Jan fell into emptiness. He dropped to a depth of 30 meters, the height of a 10-story building. The fall stopped when the icy walls narrowed. He found himself trapped in a vice-like grip of ice, like a cork in a bottle. His ski was jammed, his arms pinned to his sides. He hung in complete darkness, unable to move. Inside the glacier, the temperature remained a constant minus. The ice absorbed warmth from his body. Jan started to scream, but the ice swallowed the sound. Above him, through a narrow crack, only a tiny piece of blue sky was visible. A day passed. Night. A second day. Jan began to hallucinate. He thought the ice was breathing, squeezing around him. He talked to his family, bidding them farewell. On the third day, he developed hypothermia. His mind became clouded. He stopped feeling the cold. He felt warm and cozy, a sure sign of imminent death. On the fourth day, when he was on the brink of unconsciousness, a sound came from above, the sound of skis. Someone was skiing right above the crevice. Jan summoned his remaining strength. He couldn't scream. Instead, he began to howl. A wild, inhuman wail erupted from his throat. The skier above halted. He glanced around but saw no one. The howl echoed again, a muffled sound emanating from beneath the earth. The skier felt a surge of fear, thinking it might be a mountain spirit, but curiosity prevailed. He approached the edge of the crevice and peered down. The rescue operation lasted 6 hours. To free Jan, crews had to widen the crevice using jackhammers. When he was finally raised to the surface, his body temperature was 28 degrees. Jan Baumgarten had survived. Although he lost a few toes to frostbite, he retained both his life and sanity. He became a living testament that the human voice, even transformed into a howl, can penetrate through layers of ice and the indifference of nature. Jan survived in the ice, but the hero of our next story survived a fire. He was a racing driver whose car turned into a fireball at the start. He burned alive in front of millions of television viewers until other drivers, abandoning their own cars, pulled him out. Story number 21. A Phoenix Rising from the Ashes. Nürburgring. The Nürburgring track in Germany, August 1st, 1976. The Green Hell. That was how drivers referred to this course. 22 kilometers of narrow asphalt winding through the Eifel forests. Rain intermittently fell and then ceased. Niki Lauda, the reigning world champion and leader of the championship, called for a boycott of the race due to dangerous conditions, but the majority voted otherwise. The race would take place. On the second lap, during a high-speed turn, Lauda's Ferrari's rear suspension failed. At a speed of 200 kilometers per hour, it crashed into the barriers, bounced back onto the track, and ignited. Another car collided with Lauda, who was trapped. His helmet was torn off in the impact. He found himself at the center of the blaze, with temperatures reaching 800 degrees. Poisonous fumes from burning plastic and fuel scorched his lungs, and his face melted. Marshals with fire extinguishers were far away. However, fellow drivers Arthur Merzario, Guy Edwards, Brad Langhorne, and Harold Ertl stopped their cars. They dashed into the flames. Merzario, a small Italian, dove into the fire. He fumbled for Lauda's seatbelt buckle, but the latch was jammed. Merzario burned his hands, but after 3 attempts, he managed to unfasten the belt. They pulled the burning body from the cockpit in the evening. Lauda was conscious. He asked, "How's my face?" In the hospital, a priest performed the last rites. Doctors told Niki's wife, Marlene, that he wouldn't survive until morning. He sustained severe burns on his head, face, and hands, while his lungs were scorched by toxic smoke. But Niki Lauda had other plans. He fell into a coma, but his will continued to fight. After 3 days, he awoke. After a week, he began to walk. And 42 days post-accident, with unhealed wounds and a helmet worn over blood-stained bandages, Niki Lauda returned to the cockpit. The Italian Grand Prix at Monza. When he appeared in the paddock, everyone fell silent. His face was disfigured by scars. He had lost part of his ear and his eyelids wouldn't close. Each time he donned the helmet, he experienced excruciating pain. He finished 4th in the race. His suit was soaked in blood seeping from his wounds. When he removed his helmet, journalists averted their eyes. Lauda did not win the championship that year. He withdrew from the final races in Japan due to heavy rain, stating, "My life is worth more than the title." However, he later secured 2 titles. He became a symbol of the idea that passion can burn brighter than fire, and will can be stronger than steel. Lauda triumphed over flames, But the hero of our next tale conquered heights. He was a skydiver whose main parachute failed to deploy, and the reserve parachute got tangled. He plummeted from 4,000 meters while filming his descent. Story number 22. A cameraman who recorded his own fall into the abyss. New Zealand, Lake Taupo, December 2006. Michael Holmes, an experienced skydiving instructor with thousands of jumps under his belt, was preparing for a routine tandem jump. However, today he was jumping solo to film other skydivers. Altitude 4,500 meters. Michael separated from the plane. Free fall. The wind whistled in his ears. The camera on his helmet was recording. At 1,200 meters, he pulled the ring, and that's when the nightmare began. The main parachute deployed, but the lines twisted. The canopy began to spin violently. Michael entered a spin. Centrifugal force pushed blood to his legs. His vision narrowed. He attempted to release the main canopy, but the system malfunctioned. The canopy wouldn't detach. Michael continued to fall, spinning like a top. The rotation speed reached 120 kilometers per hour. He realized that he couldn't open the reserve parachute while the main was still attached. They would tangle, resulting in disaster. But the main canopy wouldn't separate. The ground rushed up at a terrifying speed. Michael lost consciousness from the G-forces. He fell unconscious. The camera continued to film his helpless body dangling in the air. At 200 meters, just seconds before impact, a miracle occurred. Apparently, fragments of the lines from the main parachute broke. The canopy flew away, and the automatic activation device deployed, opening the reserve parachute. However, there was too little height left. The reserve canopy could not fully inflate. Michael crashed into the ground. He landed in thick blackberry bushes at the edge of a golf course. The thorny bushes acted as a cushion. When he regained consciousness, terrified golfers stood over him. "Are you alive, mate?" one asked. Michael had a punctured lung and a broken ankle, and that was all. The video from his camera went viral. It captured him fighting with the parachute, losing consciousness, and the earth filling the frame. This was a chronicle of death that had changed its mind at the last moment. Michael Holmes continued to jump. He said, "You can't be afraid of what you love, even if it tries to kill you." Michael survived in the air, but the hero of our next story survived underground, and not for just one day, but for 69. 33 Chilean miners found themselves in a stone bag 700 meters deep. The whole world was glued to their rescue, live on air. Story number 23. 33 lives in a stone bag. Chile. Atacama Desert, August 5th, 2010. San Jose Mine. A century-old mine resembling an anthill, riddled with a spiral of tunnels through the mountain. At 2 o'clock, a collapse occurred. A massive rock block weighing 700 tons, comparable to 2 Empire State Buildings, shifted and blocked the only exit. 33 miners found themselves trapped 700 meters below ground. For 17 days, the world believed them to be dead. They had food for 2 days, which they stretched to last 2 weeks. Just half cans of tuna and a sip of milk every 48 hours. They drank technical water extracted from vehicle radiators. In the darkness and heat of 35 degrees Celsius, they began to lose their sanity. However, they were united by their leader, Shift Supervisor Luis Urzua. He enforced strict discipline, organized prayers, and divided the men into groups for tasks. On August 22nd, a rescue drill broke through the ceiling of their shelter. Attached to the drill was a note written in red marker. "We are fine in the shelter, all 33. This note became a symbol of hope for all of Chile. The San Lorenzo operation commenced. 3 drilling plans were executed simultaneously. Engineers from around the world, NASA personnel, and submarine doctors all worked toward one goal. Food, medicine, letters, and even a mini projector for watching soccer were sent down to the miners. On October 13th, on the 69th day of entrapment, the Phoenix rescue capsule, painted in the colors of the Chilean flag, began its ascent. 1 billion people watched the live broadcast. The first to emerge was Florencio Avalos. As he exited the capsule, he was greeted by the President of Chile and his tearful son. Last, as a captain leaving a sinking ship, came Luis Urzua. "Mission accomplished, Mr. President," he stated. All 33 miners were rescued. It was the most complex and successful rescue operation in mining history. It demonstrated that even beneath layers of earth and in total darkness, the human spirit can shine brighter than floodlights. The Chileans emerged from the earth, but the hero of our next story emerged from a tornado. He was a schoolboy who was swept out of his home by the whirlwind, carried for half a kilometer through the air, and gently placed in a field without a tear in his clothing. Story number 24. The Boy Who Flew in a Tornado and Made It Back for Dinner. Missouri, Fordland, March 2006. 10-year-old Matt Satter sat in his trailer with his grandmother. A storm raged outside. The sky had turned green and the air was charged with electricity. Suddenly, the walls of the trailer began to vibrate. The door flew open. Matt got up to close it and saw a wall of swirling debris. An F2 tornado struck the house. The roof was torn off like a lid from a pot. The walls exploded into fragments. Matt was lifted by a monstrous force. He felt himself being pulled from the floor. His grandmother was buried under furniture. She would survive, while Matt was swept away. He found himself inside the funnel, surrounded by boards, metal shards, and branches whirling around him. He was flying in complete darkness, stunned by the roar of the wind. Later, he would recount that it felt like being in a washing machine. He lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was lying on soft grass. Silence. A light rain was falling. Matt felt himself over. His arms and legs were intact. His head was buzzing, with a bump at the back. His clothes were intact, except his shirt was unbuttoned. He stood up and looked around. He was in the middle of a field. The house was gone. Matt walked across the field and soon saw lights from a neighboring house. It turned out that the tornado had carried him 398 meters, nearly 4 football fields. And he didn't just carry it, he gently lowered it without breaking a single bone. The examining doctors found only a few scratches and a mild concussion. This case is extraordinary. Typically, those caught in a tornado perish from collisions with debris or the ground. Matt Satter became a living anomaly, a man whom the wind did not kill, but merely relocated. Matt soared within a tornado. However, the hero of our next tale ascended with balloons, not specialized ones, but ordinary ones purchased from a toy store. He was a Brazilian priest aiming to raise funds for truck drivers, but he found himself drifting into the open ocean, disappearing forever. Story number 25. The priest who flew away on balloons to meet God. Brazil, the city of Paranaguá, April 20th, 2008. Father Adelir de Carli, a Catholic priest, prepares for a campaign. He wishes to bring attention to the issues faced by long-haul drivers. His idea is quite unique. He would fly with 1,000 colorful helium balloons. Father Adelir was not a novice. He was an experienced parachutist. He made preparations, donned a thermal suit, packed a GPS, satellite phone, parachute, and food. At 1 p.m., he took off. The brilliant cluster of balloons lifted him into the sky to the applause of his parishioners. He planned to reach the town of Dourados, but the wind had different plans. The priest was carried towards the ocean. He ascended to a height of 6,000 meters. The temperature dropped significantly. After a few hours, he called for rescue. "I need you to teach me how to use the GPS," he said. It turned out he did not know how to determine his coordinates. The rescuers were stunned. "You don't know where you are? All I see is water." The phone battery was depleting and the wind was picking up. The priest was drifting in the open ocean. The last thing he said was, "I'm losing altitude. I will have to land on the water." He was searched for by aircraft and ships from the Brazilian Navy. They only found a cluster of colorful balloons floating on the waves. Father Adelir's body was discovered 3 months later, 100 kilometers from shore. This story became an example of tragic recklessness. Good intentions and faith cannot replace navigational knowledge. Father Adelir sought to perform a miracle but fell victim to physics. Although Father Adelir perished due to his error, the hero of our next story survived because of a mistake. He was a soldier who was shot, but the bullet struck his belt buckle, ricocheted, passed through his body without damaging any organs, and exited. He pretended to be dead. The story of survival after a shooting has already been told. Vyacheslava Mogil. I will replace it with another. Father Adelier lost his life, but the hero of our next story survived, even though a harpoon bolt became lodged in his head. He was swimming with friends when a tragic accident occurred, and a steel harpoon pierced his brain entirely. Yet, he did not even lose consciousness and managed to swim ashore. Story number 26. Harpoon in the Head and the Miracle of Awareness. Miami, June 2012. 16-year-old Yasser Lopez and his friends are fishing at a lake. They have an underwater gun. They are goofing around. While loading the weapon, a friend's finger slips. A shot rings out. A steel harpoon, 90 centimeters long, shoots away at incredible speed, striking Yasser directly in the forehead, just above his right eye. The bolt passes through his brain and exits through the back of his head. Yasser falls into the water. His friends, in a panic, pull him out, and then something unbelievable happens. Yasser is conscious. What happened, he asks. Why do you look so shocked? He does not feel any pain. He doesn't realize that a meter-long piece of steel is protruding from his head. He is taken to Jackson Memorial Hospital. The doctors, who have seen a lot in their careers, are left speechless. The X-ray reveals that a harpoon has gone through the right hemisphere of his brain, miraculously missing the major blood vessels and centers responsible for breathing and heartbeat. The surgeons spend 3 hours removing the arrow. First, they cut off the ends of the harpoon to fit the head into the tomograph. Then, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, they twist out the rod. Yasser survived. He spent 2 weeks in a coma. When he woke up, he could talk. He remembered his parents. After 3 months, he was discharged from the hospital. He had some minor issues with his left hand and memory, but he was alive and mentally sound. The doctors labeled it a miracle of the millimeter. If the harpoon had passed just a bit lower or to the left, Yasser would have died instantly. Yasser survived with metal in his head, but the hero of our next story lived with a bullet in his head for 5 years, unaware of it. He thought he simply had a toothache, until the dentist spotted a foreign object on the X-ray. This is story number 27, a toothache from a caliber .22, Georgia, USA, 2005. 23-year-old construction worker Patrick Klauser complains of a toothache. The pain has been bothering him for several days. He takes pain relievers, applies ice, but nothing works. Finally, his wife convinces him to visit the dentist. The doctor examines his mouth, notices slight swelling on the roof of the mouth, but sees nothing alarming. Let's take an X-ray, he says. The image develops. The doctor looks at it and cleans his glasses. He looks again. Patrick, he says with a trembling voice, there's a bullet in your head. The X-ray clearly shows a piece of lead measuring 10 centimeters lodged in his brain, just above the palate. Patrick is in shock. Where did it come from? Then he remembers. 5 years ago, on New Year's, he was working on a roof. He felt a sharp blow to his head, but thought it was a piece of roofing. There was blood, but he simply bandaged the injury with a plaster and forgot about it. It turned out, someone had fired a shot in celebration. The bullet arced back down, penetrated the roof of his mouth, and got stuck in his brain. For 5 years, he lived with the bullet in his head, worked, got married, and raised children. The only symptoms were occasional tooth pain and blurred vision. The surgeons removed the bullet, and Patrick made a full recovery. This story serves as a reminder of how little we know about our own bodies and how dangerous it is to shoot into the air. A bullet always falls somewhere. Patrick carried a bullet, but the hero of our next story carried a twin inside his stomach. For 36 years, he believed he had a tumor, while doctors discovered a fully formed embryo inside him. This is story number 28, the man who was pregnant with his brother. India, Nagpur. June 1999. Sanju Faga, a 36-year-old farmer, had suffered from mockery throughout his life. He had a huge belly. He looked like a woman 9 months pregnant. Neighbors joked that he would soon give birth. Sanju endured it all, attributing everything to obesity. But one night, his abdomen grew so large that it began to pressure his diaphragm. Sanju started to suffocate. He was taken to the hospital. The doctors concluded that it was a massive tumor. They commenced surgery. The surgeon made an incision. A flood of fluid emerged. Then, he felt something solid. He reached inside and grasped someone's hand. Inside Sanju Bhagat's belly was a peculiar creature. It had legs, arms, long nails, and even hair. It was not a child, it was Sanju's twin brother. This phenomenon is known as fetus in fetu, an embryo within an embryo. In the early stages of pregnancy, one twin absorbs the other. Typically, the absorbed one dies, but in rare cases, it continues to live parasitically within the sibling's body, feeding off their blood. Sanju's brother had been living inside him for 36 years. He lacked a brain, but developed limbs and bones. The doctors removed the parasite. Sanju survived. His belly disappeared. However, the psychological trauma lingered. He refused to look at what had been extracted from him. While Sanju carried his brother, the hero of our next story carried a secret. He was the richest man in the world, yet lived like a beggar. He saved on matches and even refused to pay the ransom for his own grandson, who had his ear cut off. Story number 29. The richest miser in history. Paul Getty was an oil tycoon. In the mid-20th century, he was the wealthiest man on the planet. His fortune was estimated in billions, but his greed was even greater. In his mansion in England, he installed a payphone for guests so they wouldn't waste his money on calls. He laundered his own clothes to avoid paying laundresses. He reused envelopes. But the pinnacle of his stinginess occurred in 1973. His 16-year-old grandson, Paul Getty II, was kidnapped in Rome. The abductors demanded a ransom of $17 million. For the grandfather, that was pocket change. But when journalists inquired whether he would pay, he replied, "I have 14 grandchildren. If I pay even a cent, I will have 14 kidnapped grandsons." He refused. The kidnappers waited for 5 months. They sent a package to the newspaper office. Inside was a severed ear of the boy and a lock of hair. Only then did Getty agree to negotiations. He negotiated the price down to $3 million, but ultimately paid only $2,200,000, the maximum amount that was tax-free. He loaned the remaining $800,000 to his son, the father of the kidnapped boy, at 4% interest. The grandson was released, but he was shattered. He became a drug addict, suffered a stroke, and remained an invalid for life. Paul Getty died alone, surrounded by his wealth and masterpieces, yet despised by his own family. His story is a parable demonstrating that wealth is not measured by the zeros in the bank. Getty hoarded money, but the hero of our final story hoarded time. He was a man who spent 27 years in prison fighting against apartheid, yet emerged not as a broken old man, but as a president who forgave his enemies. Story number 30. Prisoner number 46,664, who became the father of a nation. South Africa, Robben Island, a prison for political prisoners. Cell number 5. Its dimensions are 2 by 2 meters. On a thin mattress lies a man named Nelson Mandela. It is the year 1964. Mandela is 46 years old. He has been sentenced to life imprisonment for sabotage and conspiracy aimed at overthrowing the government. The apartheid regime, a system of legalized racism, seeks to erase his name from history. He is prohibited from reading newspapers. He is allowed 1 letter and 1 visitor every 6 months. He works in a limestone quarry, breaking stones under the scorching sun. Dust irritates his eyes, yet he refuses to wear sunglasses, viewing it as a sign of weakness. The guards attempt to break him. They mock him, forcing him to dig holes and immediately cover them back up. But Mandela responds with dignity. He learns the language of his captors, Afrikaans. He studies their history, their poetry. He understands that to defeat an enemy, one must comprehend their fears. He spends 27 years in prison. During that time, the world changes. People land on the moon, regimes fall, computers emerge, while Mandela remains incarcerated. Nevertheless, his name becomes a rallying symbol. The campaign Free Nelson Mandela spreads across the globe. On February 11, 1990, the gates of Victor Verster prison swing open. A 71-year-old man, straight as an arrow, steps into freedom. Violence rages in the country. Whites fear revenge. Blacks thirst for blood. Everyone anticipates a call to arms from Mandela. But he does what no one expects. He calls for reconciliation. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it, he states. In 1994, Nelson Mandela becomes the first black president of South Africa. He invites his jailer to his inauguration. He establishes a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where victims recount their sufferings and confessing perpetrators receive amnesty. It was a unique experiment in history, an attempt to heal a nation's wounds not through vengeance, but forgiveness. Mandela lived to the age of 95. He demonstrated that a person can emerge from the darkest prison, not filled with hatred, but with love capable of changing the world. We close the final folder of this fourth cycle. We have witnessed crazies who consumed coal and jumped into volcanoes. We have seen heroes who saved children and were born in the skies. We have encountered villains and saints, kings and beggars. These tales teach us one thing. Human life is not a straight line. It is a labyrinth, full of dead ends, traps, and secret doors. And the key to this labyrinth is not strength, wealth, or even intelligence. The key is will. The will to live, the will to believe, the will to remain human, even when the whole world is against you. The archive may be closing, but stories endure as long as you remember them, and as long as you are capable of wonder. Until we meet again, M.